Two British princesses are getting swept up in the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Beatrice and Eugenie.
On the evening of the 24th of January 2026, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie attended a private function at Windsor Castle that appeared, to every eye present, entirely unremarkable. They arrived together, dressed with their customary understated elegance, and moved through the room with the particular grace of women who have spent their entire adult lives learning how to be observed without being seen. They smiled at the right moments. They engaged with warmth and apparent ease. They said nothing that could be quoted, nothing that could be misread, nothing that deviated by a single degree from the carefully maintained composure that had defined their public presence for the better part of a decade. To the small gathering of family members and trusted associates around them, they were exactly what they had always appeared to be: steady, contained, unreadable. What no one in that room could have known, except the two women themselves, was that they had made a decision 3 days earlier that would make that evening's performance of composure the last one they would ever be required to give. Before we begin today's royal update, I want to take a quick moment. Many of you watch these videos but haven't subscribed yet, and you don't want to miss the latest developments and fascinating stories from the world of royalty. Subscribing is completely free and keeps you updated as everything unfolds. While you're here, tell us, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments. It's amazing to see viewers joining us from all around the world. To understand what Beatrice and Eugenie are now prepared to say, one must first understand what it cost them to say nothing for as long as they did. They are not women the public has ever fully known, which is itself a consequence of the story now emerging. They exist in the complicated middle distance of the royal world, a position that carries all of the scrutiny of senior royal status with a fraction of its institutional protection. They were born into a family that demanded a great deal from them in terms of public representation and offered, in return, a support structure that proved, at the moment they needed it most, to be considerably less robust than its appearance suggested. They grew up watching their father's reputation accumulate shadow slowly through the 2000s and then collapse with a speed and totality in 2019 that left them standing in the wreckage of a scandal they had not created and could not escape. They attended engagements, they issued statements, they maintained the surface with a discipline that those who witnessed it up close describe, without exception, as extraordinary, and they did all of it while carrying something their public composure gave absolutely no indication of: a knowledge, a specific, weighted, carefully guarded knowledge of what their father had said to each of them in private, and what he had made unmistakably clear would happen if they ever chose to say it back. The nature of Andrew's threat is something this account will address in precise and unflinching detail. But the threshold question, the one that must be answered before the threat itself can be properly understood, is this: why did it work for so long? The answer is not simple, and it is not flattering to the institution that allowed the conditions for it to persist. Beatrice and Eugenie were not naive women who failed to recognize what was being done to them. They recognized it immediately, completely, and with a clarity that the legal steps both women took independently within weeks of the relevant conversations make entirely apparent. They were women who understood their position with uncomfortable precision. Their public roles, their access to the financial and reputational infrastructure of the monarchy, their ability to continue operating within the only world they had ever been prepared to inhabit, existed within a framework whose stability was not, as they had perhaps previously assumed, guaranteed by birth alone. It was maintained by relationships, by institutional goodwill, by the quiet exercise of influence that their father, despite his public disgrace, had not entirely lost. Andrew knew this. And in the days following the most catastrophic public moment of his life, when his instinct for self-preservation had been stripped of every other available instrument, he used it. Sources close to both women, speaking now with the careful gravity of people who understand the weight of what they are confirming, describe a father who did not approach his daughters in the aftermath of the Newsnight interview as a man seeking comfort or solidarity or even simple familial loyalty. He approached them as a man securing an asset. The distinction, they say, was apparent from the first words of each conversation. There was no preamble, one source said quietly. No acknowledgement of what they were going through or what the interview had done to the family. He went directly to what he needed and what he intended to do to ensure he got it. Beatrice was summoned first. The conversation took place at Royal Lodge on the morning of the 20th of November 2019. What was said in that room has not been spoken publicly by either participant until now. But its effects, documented, witnessed, and preserved with a legal precision that leaves no room for ambiguity, have shaped the trajectory of both women's lives for nearly 7 years. What Andrew said was not a request. It was not a plea dressed in the language of paternal authority. It was a threat, delivered in a tone so measured and so deliberate that its coldness, sources say, was the detail that stayed with Beatrice longest after she left the room, not the words themselves. The temperature of the man who said them. The morning of the 20th of November 2019 was cold and overcast at Royal Lodge, the kind of grey November day that offers no comfort and no distraction, only the particular bleakness of a landscape matching the mood of the people inside it. Andrew had been awake since before dawn. The interview had aired 4 days earlier, and the aftermath had exceeded, in its speed and its totality, even the most pessimistic projections of his remaining advisors. Charitable patronages were issuing distancing statements with an efficiency that suggested the letters had been drafted in advance. Senior palace officials had stopped returning calls. The newspapers had moved from criticism to something closer to contempt. And inside Royal Lodge, the man who had sat across from Emily Maitlies and somehow made every answer worse than the question that preceded it was not, by the accounts of those present in the house that morning, processing what had happened with anything resembling remorse or reflection. He was calculating, assessing what remained, identifying what could still be controlled. And when Beatrice arrived at the house that morning at his request, she walked into a conversation that had already been decided before she sat down. Andrew opened without preamble. There was no inquiry into how she was managing the public fallout, no acknowledgement of the position the interview had placed his daughters in, no moment of paternal softness before the substance of what he needed to say. He told Beatrice that the story being told about him in the press was a distortion, that the full truth of his situation contained dimensions that the public did not have access to, and that he had made a deliberate decision to ensure they never would. He told her that the coming weeks and months would require his family to present a unified and unquestioning front, and that this was not something he was asking of her as a father appealing to a daughter's loyalty. It was something he was requiring. When Beatrice, according to the source with direct knowledge of the exchange, asked what the word requiring meant in practical terms, Andrew's answer crossed into territory that the same source describes as a line from which there was no return. He told her that her position within the royal family, the access, the engagements, the financial structures that supported her public role, the palace communications apparatus that managed her reputation and protected her from the kind of press attention that could, without that protection, become considerably more damaging, all of it existed within a framework he still had meaningful influence over. And that his continued willingness to exercise that influence in her favor was contingent on her conduct in the period ahead. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward or make any gesture that could be described as physically intimidating. He simply stated it in the tone of a man communicating terms he considered entirely reasonable and waited for her to understand. Eugenie's conversation followed 2 days later on the 22nd of November. Andrew had recalibrated between the two exchanges, whether through strategic deliberation or the instinctive adjustment of a man who had spent decades reading people and modifying his approach accordingly. With Eugenie, he was less explicit about the structural leverage and more personal in his framing. He spoke at length about family loyalty as a concept whose full meaning she needed to sit with before making any decisions about how she conducted herself in public going forward. He spoke about the fragility of carefully built lives and the speed with which reputations, even those of people entirely uninvolved in a scandal, could be damaged when family members failed to hold a consistent position under pressure. And then, according to a source Eugenie later confided in, he said the thing that transformed the conversation from a pressure into a threat with a precision that required no further elaboration. He told her that he was aware of certain choices both his daughters had made in their personal and professional lives over the preceding years. choices that had never reached the press, choices that had remained private because he had, quietly and without drawing attention to the fact, ensured that they remained so. He told her that his continued willingness to exercise that same discretion going forward was something she should give serious thought to before deciding where her loyalties in this matter ultimately lay. The temperature of the room, the source said, changed completely when he said it, not because he had shouted or threatened in any way that could be pointed to directly, but because both people in the room understood exactly what had just been communicated and exactly what it meant. Both women, in the weeks that followed, moved through their public obligations with a surface composure that gave nothing away to anyone observing them. But privately, and without initially coordinating with each other, each had taken an identical step. Within 6 weeks of their respective conversations with Andrew, both Beatrice and Eugenie had engaged independent legal counsel, solicitors with no institutional royal connection and no obligation to any palace interest. Each had provided a detailed account of what had been said to them. Each had requested that the account be formally documented and securely preserved. Neither submitted those documents to any authority. Neither shared the fact of the consultation with any family member. They were not, at that stage, preparing to act. They were preparing to be protected. And in early 2020, when a message reached both women through a back channel they have never publicly identified, confirming that Andrew was aware of the legal consultations and that his patience with what he termed their failure to demonstrate appropriate family solidarity had a defined and finite limit, those documents became something more than protection. They became the foundation of a case that would take nearly 6 more years to find the moment it was finally ready to be heard. There is a moment in the life of every institution when the gap between what it knows and what it chooses to act upon becomes wide enough to constitute a decision in itself. The palace reached that moment with respect to Andrew and his daughters not once, but repeatedly across a 5-year period, and on each occasion it made the same choice. It managed. It contained. It prioritized the coherence of the institutional surface over the welfare of the 2 women whose silence was actively being exploited beneath it. That choice was not made by any single person, and it was not the product of deliberate cruelty. It was the product of something in many ways more difficult to confront. A culture so thoroughly oriented toward reputation preservation and crisis containment that the question of what was actually happening to Beatrice and Eugenie inside the silence they were maintaining never received the direct and unambiguous institutional attention it demanded. And the cost of that failure was paid, day after day, and engagement after engagement, and carefully worded statement after carefully worded statement, by the 2 people least positioned to refuse the invoice. The paper trail that has since emerged tells a story of awareness without accountability that is, in its own quiet way, as troubling as the threat that necessitated it. Internal briefings circulated among a select group of senior palace aides as early as the spring of 2020 flagged what one document, later described in detail by a source who had personally reviewed it, referred to as an unusual pattern of communicative restriction around the York princesses. The language was institutional and careful, the kind of phrasing designed to register concern without triggering the escalation that genuine concern would have demanded. But its meaning was not ambiguous to those who received it. Something was wrong in the dynamic between Andrew and his daughters, and the wrongness had a directional quality that pointed unmistakably toward him rather than toward them. 2 senior aides who pursued the matter further and raised concerns directly about the well-being of Beatrice and Eugenie during that period were quietly reassigned within 3 months. Neither was given an explicit reason, neither required one. The institution had communicated its position with the efficiency it reserved for messages it preferred not to put in writing. This was a matter for management, not investigation, not protection, management. And everyone who received that message understood precisely what it meant, and precisely what it was asking them not to do. King Charles occupied the most uncomfortable position of all. He had inherited alongside the crown a brother whose conduct had become the single most destabilizing reputational liability the modern monarchy had faced, and whose removal from public life had resolved the visible problem without addressing anything beneath the surface. Charles had been told enough, according to sources with direct knowledge of his private briefings during 2020 and 2021, to understand that the relationship between Andrew and his daughters carried a tension that went beyond the ordinary strains of a family navigating public scandal together. He had been given enough to ask the next question. He did not ask it. Sources close to his private office are careful in how they describe this, reaching consistently for language that stops short of direct accusation while leaving no genuine ambiguity about its meaning. There are moments, one insider said, when a king understands that formally receiving information creates a formal obligation to act on it, and that the alternative to receiving it formally is to remain, technically and institutionally, in a position of incomplete knowledge. Whether that calculation was conscious or instinctive in Charles's case is something only he can answer. What is not in question is its consequence. Two women were left without the institutional protection that the institution was capable of providing and chose, for reasons that served its own coherence rather than their welfare, not to extend. It was three women outside the formal chain of institutional authority who finally dismantled the architecture of silence from within. Catherine was the first to move. At a Windsor gathering in December 2025, she found herself beside Beatrice at a dinner that had thinned to a smaller and more intimate gathering than its official roster suggested. What began as careful conversation shifted gradually, and then with sudden intensity, into something neither woman had planned or prepared for. Beatrice did not intend, by the account of someone Catherine confided in afterward, to say as much as she said. But Catherine had a quality in private of making the truth feel safer than the silence that had been protecting it, and over the course of nearly 3 hours, the outline of what Andrew had done, and what the palace had failed to do about it, emerged with a completeness that Catherine had not anticipated and could not, once received, set aside. She made a commitment to Beatrice that night that she sought no institutional approval for and ran through no palace communications channel. She would not allow this to remain buried. Princess Anne's contribution came through a different register entirely. At a private family occasion in late January 2026, she positioned herself beside Eugenie with the deliberate patience of someone who had already decided that the most important thing she could offer was simply unhurried and unconditional presence. What Eugenie told her that evening, released in the gradual and then gathering way of someone finally permitted to put down something they had been carrying alone for too long, confirmed everything Anne had suspected and provided the final piece of what was now becoming an unassailable account. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, said nothing publicly and sought no visible role in what followed. But it was Sophie who quietly coordinated the private legal infrastructure that ensured the joint account, when it was finally submitted, would be documented with a precision and a protection that made it impossible to receive, impossible to file quietly, and impossible to forget. It did not happen in a palace. There was no legal team arranged around a formal table, no institutional proceeding of any officially convened kind, no palace official present to manage the narrative of what was being decided. It happened in a kitchen, on a grey and unremarkable February morning, when Beatrice arrived at Eugenie's door without announcement, and the two sisters sat down together with nothing between them except 2 cups of tea and the accumulated weight of nearly 7 years that had never once been set down in the same room at the same time. What was said in that kitchen has not been recorded and will not be recounted here in its entirety. But those close to both women describe a conversation that moved through its 4 hours with the particular quality of something that had been waiting a very long time for the conditions that would finally allow it to happen. It did not proceed with anger, though anger would have been entirely warranted. It did not proceed with tears, though no one present would have questioned them. It proceeded with the quiet, deliberate, undeflectable clarity of 2 women who had arrived, separately and then together, at exactly the same conclusion. They were going to tell the truth. They were going to do it correctly, carefully, and in a way that could not be quietly absorbed by the institution that had spent 5 years demonstrating its preference for absorption over accountability. And they were going to do it together, because the one thing Andrew had not anticipated when he summoned each of them separately to deliver his terms was that the distance he created between them would eventually collapse, and that what was left when it did would be considerably more formidable than either of them had been alone. The process that followed was unhurried and precise. The independent legal counsel both women had separately retained in 2019 and never formally dismissed was re-engaged within days of the kitchen conversation. The sealed documentation each had preserved from that period, maintained in secure storage for nearly 6 years without ever being submitted to any authority, was retrieved, reviewed, and incorporated into a joint written account compiled over 3 weeks with a legal thoroughness that left no procedural vulnerability available to anyone who might have preferred to find one. The account was submitted through a protected legal channel to a senior palace official on the 4th of February 2026. King Charles received it the same evening. Sources with knowledge of his response describe a man who read the full document twice, alone, in his private study, and did not speak to any aide or member of staff for the remainder of that night. His written reply was delivered by hand to both women the following morning. It was not long. But it contained 3 things that neither Beatrice nor Eugenie had ever received from the institution, in whose name their silence had been maintained for the better part of a decade. An acknowledgement that what had been done to them was wrong. A recognition that the palace had failed in its duty to protect them when protection was both possible and required. And a personal commitment, stated without qualification or condition, that what they had carried in silence would be carried in silence no longer. The consequences arrived quietly and with a finality that required no public announcement to be fully understood by everyone positioned to observe them. Andrew's access arrangements at Royal Lodge were formally restructured within 72 hours of Charles's receipt of the account. The conditions attached to his continued residency amounted, in practical terms, to a supervised and severely curtailed presence in a property he had treated for years as unconditional sovereign territory. His remaining ceremonial connections, reduced as they had already become, were severed without ceremony or statement. No press release was issued. No carefully worded palace communication was distributed to the royal correspondents who had covered Andrew's decline with such exhaustive attention over the preceding years. The institution had made its decision and communicated it in the register institutions use when they wished their meaning to be received without being quoted. Inside royal circles, the message landed with the clarity it was designed to carry. The protection Andrew had retained for years through the implicit threat of what he knew and what he might do with it had been permanently withdrawn. His era, in every sense that the word era can be applied to a man whose public role had already been largely dismantled, was over. Beatrice and Eugenie have not given interviews. They have not appeared on any platform to recount what was done to them or to describe in their own words what 7 years of enforced silence cost them in ways that no external accounting can fully measure. They have not staged a moment of public reclamation or sought the kind of visible vindication that the press would have covered with the same exhaustive attention it gave to the original scandal. They have simply continued, as they always have, to move through their lives with a composure the public has consistently underestimated and consistently misread as absence. But those who know them describe 2 women who carry themselves with something new and unmistakable in their bearing. One close friend, searching for the precise word, settled finally on lighter. They are lighter, she said, in the specific way of people who have put down something they were never meant to be carrying and have finally, after long enough, stopped expecting to feel its weight. The House of Windsor held its breath when the truth arrived, and when it finally exhaled, what remained was not spectacle, not scandal, not the operatic public confrontation the press might have written for them, just 2 daughters. The truth they had preserved with extraordinary care across an extraordinary length of time, and the quiet, irreversible dignity of having finally been believed.